She was 7 years old, barefoot on the waxed floor of Mercy General's pediatric corridor, and the fluorescent lights made her skin look almost blue where the wet cloth of her leggings clung to her shins. She had a hospital bracelet, sliding loose on her wrist, thin as a switch, her hair pasted dark against the back of her neck, and a clear trash bag set upright beside her knee, as if she had packed for a trip no one had explained. Inside the bag sat 3 shirts folded with rigid care, a winter coat 2 sizes too small with one missing button, and a stuffed rabbit with one eye gone and the seam at the ear restitched in red thread. She was not speaking. She was not crying. At 2:07 a.m., with rain ticking against the ambulance bay glass and the vent system pushing bleach and stale coffee through the hallway, she sat between a linen cart and a humming ice machine, like someone waiting for permission to exist. Sandra Briggs heard the ice machine before she saw the child. It made a dry, grinding click every 18 seconds, a noise maintenance had promised to fix in July and had written down on a yellow slip, now curling on a corkboard by the breakroom sink. Sandra had worked night shift for 11 years, 5 nights a week, and knew every mechanical sound in that building the way some people knew hymns. The old boiler in administrative coughed at 140. The elevator nearest pediatrics shuddered before it stopped at odd floors. The vending machine by room 214 dropped Diet Cola cans too hard and dented them at the rim. She had learned to sort emergency from nuisance by ear long before she finished charting her first cup of coffee. That morning, the corridor sounded wrong in a smaller way. And that was what pulled her down the hall past the nurse station, pen still in her scrub pocket, and latex gloves crinkling in one hand. She expected a spilled drink, a family member sleeping where they should not, maybe one of the maintenance contractors tracking mud across clean tile. What she found was a little girl sitting straight-backed against a painted cinder block wall, knees lifted to her chest, heels pale and damp against the polished floor. The girl's shoes were not on her feet. They were set beside the trash bag in a perfect pair, toes facing outward, laces tied in careful double knots that looked too deliberate for a child that age. Sandra stopped a few feet away and crouched down slowly, as if sudden movement might break something fragile in the air between them. "Hey there," she said. "I'm Sandra. Are you hurt?" The girl lifted her eyes and then lowered them again to the rabbit in the bag. "No," she whispered. "Do you know where your grown-up is?" A small shake of the head. "Do you know your room number?" Another shake. No panic, no tears, just a practiced economy of movement, like she had been trained by consequence to answer only what she had to. Sandra glanced toward intake and then back at the child, trying to place the bracelet number from memory. The barcode strip was wrinkled, the print smudged by water, and the clasp was 1 notch too wide for her wrist. A transport gurney squeaked around the far corner, pushed by an orderly who looked once, slowed, then kept moving. A man in a Dayton fire jacket walked past carrying 2 orange blankets. He looked at the little girl, then at Sandra, then at the chartboard on the wall as if it might excuse him from stopping. He disappeared into room 209. Rain kept tapping the glass in a thin, steady rhythm. "It's cold down here," Sandra said, softer now. "Can I get you socks?" The child hesitated long enough for the ice machine to click twice. "Okay," she whispered. Sandra went to the supply alcove and found pediatric grippers in a bin marked size XS, then came back with a warmed blanket from the cabinet by triage. She knelt again and held the socks out. The girl took them and put them on herself, one heel at a time, fingers stiff from cold but precise, then lifted the blanket over her shoulders without help and tucked it under her legs. She did everything quietly. That was the part that stayed with Sandra. Later, when people asked what was worst, not bruises, not shouting. Silence arranged like furniture. At 2:31, Sandra called family intake and got a voicemail. At 2:34, she called again and reached a clerk who said the overnight desk had one worker for 3 counties and no emergency bed assignment authorized without visible acute injury. The clerk's voice sounded tired rather than cruel, as if the sentence had been spoken too often to carry weight anymore. Sandra took down a reference number on the back of a medication label. At 2:46, she asked security to review exterior cameras for a guardian. At 2:52, the deputy, waiting on tox screens by ER triage, looked over and asked if the kid belonged upstairs. Sandra said she didn't know yet. He nodded once and returned to his phone. By 3:17 on a Thursday morning in late October, the child had not moved from the wall except to slide her socks higher. She kept one hand on the trash bag drawstring as though someone might take it. A pastor in a dark overcoat came through with a paper cup and a Bible tucked under his arm, paused and gave Sandra a sympathetic look from 10 feet away that held no intention of crossing the distance. 2 rideshare drivers drifted down the hall looking for names on discharge paperwork, slowed at the sight of a patched blanket over small shoulders, and kept going when no one addressed them. One of the janitors asked Sandra if she needed a mop and then corrected himself when he saw the girl, saying sorry without stopping his cart. At 3:40, Sandra brought applesauce and a plastic spoon. The child looked at it, then at Sandra's face, and ate 3 spoonfuls before setting the cup beside the rabbit in the bag. She thanked her in a voice so small it almost disappeared into the vents. She still did not cry. Outside, the rain thinned just before dawn and left the city slick and silver under sodium lamps. 2 blocks from Mercy General, the old brick courthouse sat dark except for one security bulb above the side entrance, its windows reflecting wet pavement and the faint amber of traffic lights cycling through empty streets. The first motorcycles rolled in at 5:28. Not fast, not loud yet, 2 by 2 in measured intervals, tires hissing on rain-dark asphalt. By 5:41, there were enough of them to fill one side of Jefferson Street. Engines idling low, headlights casting long white bars against courthouse stone. People in parked cars watched through fogged windshields and held their breath. By 6:03, the line stretched farther than most people on that block had ever seen. Patched leather and chrome and road grime arranged in patient geometry that looked less like chance and more like intent. A woman delivering breakfast trays to the county annex pulled into a side lot, saw the cutoffs and inked forearms, and backed out without shutting off her blinker. A man in a pickup with a contractor logo locked his doors, though his windows were already up. 2 college students who had stopped for coffee stood by the curb and filmed from behind a newspaper box, whispering that something big was about to happen and that they should probably leave. No one counted out loud at first. Security did, eventually, from the courthouse annex where the camera feed could pan wide enough to capture the full staggered line. 112, 189, 246. The number climbed with each minute and each incoming rumble that thickened the air like distant weather. At 6:27, the count reached 318 motorcycles, logged by timestamp and plate image, and the city filled in its own conclusion before a single rider spoke to anyone. Inside Mercy General, Sandra stepped to the pediatric corridor window at the end of the hall and saw the faint, moving reflection of headlights on the low cloud. She did not know yet why so many riders had come downtown before breakfast, only that the sound reached the hospital in waves, entered through glass and cinder block, and settled under the ribs like a second pulse. The child heard it too. She looked up from the rabbit, listened, and for the first time that night shifted closer to Sandra's knee. Across town, In a duplex with peeling white trim near Linden Avenue, Tom Dixon opened his front door at 6:31 and found a neat stack of laundered children's clothes on the mat, folded by size with a pair of mittens set on top, and a note in careful block letters that read, "For someone who needs them." He stood there in socks and a faded thermal shirt, scar on his left cheek catching the porch light, and listened as the sound of 318 engines rolled through wet October air toward Mercy General. He read the note twice on the porch, once for the words and once for the pressure marks where the writer had pressed too hard at the corners of each letter, as if careful printing could keep the sentence from being misunderstood. The clothes smelled like unscented detergent and dryer heat, long gone cool. Not charity bin sour, not mildew, not basement. A pair of purple leggings sat on top of the stack, folded into a square no bigger than his palm, and beneath them were 2 T-shirts, 1 pair of socks, and a child's cardigan, with plastic buttons shaped like flowers. The engines in the distance held steady and low, and he knew that sound by texture as much as volume. Not a weekend run. Not noise for noise's sake. Formation. Tom Dixon stood with his hand on the doorframe, bare feet on cold concrete, and watched the wet street gather dawn at the edges. Across the duplex lot, Mrs. Kinney in Unit B was pulling her trash can to the curb in a robe and slippers, then froze when the rumble thickened and looked toward downtown with the same tight mouth she used when teenagers cut through the alley. She caught sight of Tom with the clothes in his hands and gave a quick nod that landed somewhere between apology and caution. "Big crowd out there," she said. "Hope nobody starts trouble." Tom looked down at the little cardigan, then back toward the sound moving through the city. "Not today," he said. He stepped inside, set the clothes on his kitchen table beside an ashtray he had stopped using 3 winters earlier, and dressed in the order his body preferred when the knees were bad. Right boot first, left brace second, jeans over both, thermal tucked, old black T-shirt, then vest. The vest had gone soft at the seams from 27 years of rain, sun, and gas station coffee, and one patch at the shoulder had started to fray where a dog once caught it jumping a fence outside Chillicothe. He buttoned nothing. He never did unless the weather turned hard. At 6:34, his phone buzzed once on the counter with a text from Ray Sullivan that contained only 3 words and a location pin. Courthouse, side lot. He did not answer. He slid the stack of children's clothes into a grocery sack, tucked the note into his wallet behind a photograph of a teenage girl in a graduation cap he had not attended, and walked out. By the time he reached Linden Avenue, the city had already decided what the motorcycles meant. A man at a bus stop stepped back from the curb when Tom passed, lifting his lunch pail against his chest like protection. A delivery van slowed at a light and locked its doors, the click audible through Tom's half-helmet as he idled beside it. The rider 2 lanes over, a broad-shouldered man with a graying beard and an Army Ranger tab tattooed above his glove line, caught Tom's eye and lifted 2 fingers from the grip. No grin. No performance. The signal moved down the column, quiet and exact. People saw leather and expected danger because that was easier than counting failures. The paradox sat in plain view on wet Dayton asphalt that morning, as blunt as chrome in gray light. The men most parents warned their children about were the only ones moving in disciplined numbers toward a child everyone else had walked around. Sometimes the city's safest wall was built by the people the city feared on sight. Sometimes protection arrived loud enough to make windows tremble, because nobody had listened when it arrived small and quiet. Tom cut east on 5th, then north toward Mercy General, passing the old brick courthouse where rows of parked motorcycles stood in staggered lines that left clear lanes between them. No blocked hydrants, no spilled into crosswalks, no chaos. Court security officers watched from the annex door with clipboards and wary posture. Ray stood near the curb in a denim jacket over his cut, counting arrivals with a pencil stub against a folded legal pad, as if he were checking inventory before a long haul. When Tom rolled past, Ray nodded once toward Mercy and tapped 2 fingers against his own chest, then pointed south. Go. Tom kept moving. He had no use for speeches, and Ray knew it. The rain had thinned to mist by then, just enough to bead on his gloves and make the painted lane markers shine. Mercy General rose ahead in its mix of old and new construction, the original 1948 brick wing stitched to a pale concrete addition from the late 90s, then a glass-fronted emergency renovation paid for by a donor family, whose name sat in brushed steel letters over the ambulance bay. One letter in that sign had been out for 3 months. From the street it read, Mercy Genera. Nobody fixed it. The boiler in administrative still failed whenever the temperature dropped below 40, and the vents in pediatric pushed alternating bands of heat and cold like indecision. He turned into the south entrance at 6:49 and killed the engine near the staff lot fence. Security had moved orange cones to shape incoming traffic, and the guard at the booth, a retired Marine named Lyle, who wore reading glasses on a lanyard and carried peppermints in his shirt pocket, leaned out to get plate numbers as riders continued arriving in measured intervals. Morning, Dixon, Lyle said, voice flat with fatigue. We're logging everyone today. Tom nodded. You should. Lyle wrote the number, then glanced at the grocery sack strapped behind Tom's seat. Dropping off? Yeah. Lyle held his look half a second longer, then waved him through. Use employee side. Family desk is backed up. Inside the sliding doors, Mercy smelled like every underfunded hospital did before full day shift. Antiseptic over old coffee, floor wax over steam heat, hand soap too floral for the season, and somewhere beneath all of it, a metallic hint from sterilizer rooms that never fully left the air. The lobby television played muted morning weather while captions crawled 2 lines behind the speaker. A volunteer in a red vest slept upright in a chair with a crossword open on her lap, pen uncapped, mouth slightly open. At admissions, 2 clipboards hung from strings because someone kept walking off with pens. The check-in kiosk flashed out of service in blocky blue text above a taped paper that said, Please use window 2. Tom moved through the hall with his helmet under one arm and the bag of clothes in the other hand, boots leaving dull prints that faded as the tile dried. No one stopped him. They looked, then looked away in practice sequence, staff eyes calibrating risk from vest patches and scar tissue before deciding they were too behind to engage. A respiratory therapist pushed a cart of oxygen canisters past him and turned her body to create more clearance than needed. A dietary aide carrying sealed breakfast trays met his gaze directly and nodded once, firm and professional, then kept walking. At 6:57, overhead speakers announced shift change for pediatrics and step-down. A soft chime, followed by a recorded voice with Midwest vowels, flattened by old audio equipment. The elevators opened and released a wave of day staff with clipped IDs and wet umbrellas, and the hallway filled with the sound of rubber soles, chart binders, and tired greetings spoken without slowing down. Tom turned down the pediatric corridor where the walls had been painted with a mural of cartoon kites and balloons 10 years earlier. The yellow had faded to mustard, and one painted cloud had a water stain through it shaped like Florida. The ice machine clicked. He recognized it from 6 doors away, that same dry grind Sandra had heard all night, and the sound made the corridor feel smaller than its dimensions. A linen cart sat, half-parked, near the vending alcove with one wheel locked crooked. The vending machine hummed and cast a rectangle of weak white light onto the floor where someone had spilled apple juice hours earlier and left a tacky sheen despite the mop marks. A wall clock above room 214 read 7:01, though his watch said 7:03. The difference had probably been there since spring daylight time. Nobody had adjusted it. Sandra Briggs stood at the nurse station with a paper cup gone cold in her hand and a pen tucked behind her right ear. Her dark hair was pulled into a tired knot that had started to loosen at the neck, and the skin under her eyes carried the grainy look of a shift that should have ended 40 minutes earlier. She noticed Tom at the corridor entrance and stiffened almost imperceptibly, not with hostility so much as institutional reflex, then saw the grocery sack in his hand and the way he kept his gaze level with the station, not searching rooms, not scanning exits. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Oh." He lifted the bag slightly. "Got clothes dropped on my porch. Kids' sizes." Shelter box was chained shut again. Sandra looked at the bag, then down the corridor, then back to his face. The sounds from outside reached them as a low, continuous tremor through concrete and glass, engines idling in disciplined waves that made the medicine cups at her elbow rattle once against their plastic sleeve. "You picked a loud morning to donate," she said. Tom listened for 2 beats, hearing the formation settle in the lot beyond the south wall, and gave a short nod. "Yeah." She came around the station, taking in the scar on his cheek, the old army posture he still carried in shoulders and hands, the wet cuffs of his jeans, and the careful way he held the bag so the folded edges stayed clean. Behind her, the pediatric corridor remained bright and thin and too awake for that hour. Fluorescent light, flattening colors, monitors chiming from closed rooms, rainwater drying in maps on the tile from a dozen hurried shoes. Mercy General had always looked sturdier from outside than in. Up close, it was tape on cabinet hinges, requisition forms clipped to cracked binders, and good people trying to outwork systems built to triage scarcity. Tom stood still and waited for instruction, not because he needed permission from anyone in that building, but because he understood that institutions moved on sequence, and barging only fed the story people already told about men like him. Outside, riders kept arriving, and security kept counting, and every person in the hospital who heard that thunder drew their own conclusion first and corrected it later. The correction was the part that mattered. Sandra reached for the bag. "Follow me," she said. He fell in step beside her, deeper into pediatrics, where the air ran colder near the exterior wall, and the smell of bleach sharpened near the supply alcove. At the far end of the corridor, just beyond the linen cart and the humming ice machine, a small pair of shoes sat side by side on the waxed floor, toes pointed outward in exact alignment, waiting where someone had left them like a signal no one had answered yet. Sandra stopped at the shoes and did not touch them. Tom set the grocery sack down on a vinyl chair bolted to the wall, then crouched with one hand on his knee and looked at the laces, the double knots drawn tight and even, each bow centered, each loop the same length. Children tied shoes in a dozen careless ways, but this looked like ceremony, as if the child had been instructed that order might buy safety when nothing else would. The socks were damp at the cuffs. The soles were worn smooth at the ball of the foot, and the left toe had split where cardboard had been tucked inside to hold shape. He had seen those fixes before, in barracks, in county lockup, in halfway houses where men cut cereal boxes to line boots through winter. Poverty had a geometry. It repeated itself. The corridor clock clicked over to 7:04 while Sandra watched his face, trying to read intent in a man built like warning tape. He stood back up slowly, spine popping once at the base, and the old injury in his right knee pulled his weight to the left for half a step. 49 sat on him in specific places, a pale ridge of scar tissue on his cheek from a bottle swung in a VFW lot in 1998, two fingers that never closed fully after a convoy jack slipped in Kuwait, shoulders thickened by years of lifting what nobody else wanted to carry, and a stare trained by long roads to keep moving until there was a reason not to. He kept his hands open at his sides. Sandra noticed that too. "Where is she?" he asked. Sandra tipped her chin toward the alcove past the linen cart. "Behind there. She's been quiet all night." He nodded once and did not move yet. There were men who told their history in words, and men who let it leak from posture, from pauses, from what they did when they had leverage. Tom belonged to the second kind. 11 years in Army motor pool and convoy duty had taught him the hierarchy of sound before sight, the way a bad bearing whined half a mile before it seized, the way silence on comms could mean routine or catastrophe, depending on the second just before it. In the Gulf, he had learned to trust the tightening at the back of his neck when a road felt wrong, and that instinct had kept him breathing through 2 sandstorms and 1 route, where a burned truck sat on the shoulder like a warning no one had signed. He had not come home gentle. He had come home functional, which was different and harder to explain. By 2003, he had a ring on his finger, a daughter with milk teeth and a laugh that started in her shoulders, and a factory shift that paid enough to keep lights on in a duplex with a maple tree out front that dropped helicopters in October. By 2009, he had none of that but the daughter in photographs. The marriage failed in stages too ordinary to dramatize. Overtime, silence, apologies that arrived late, then a fight in a parking lot behind a bar where an insult landed on a night he had no extra room left, and he broke a man's jaw with 1 punch he never denied. 18 months inside on assault. Good behavior, work detail and laundry. Letters he wrote to his daughter returned unopened 3 times, then stopped returning at all. Prison had not redeemed him, it had organized him. Wake when told. Stand where marked. Eat when the gate opened. Keep your face flat. He did that and got out with less than he went in with, including his pride, which he found out was not necessary for survival anyway. What he kept was discipline, and a short list of names that still answered when his number showed up unknown. Ray Sullivan was one. The Iron Saints were another kind of one. Not clean, not saintly, not the caricature either. Men with records, men with pensions, men with hips replaced at 47, and hearing loss from artillery or machine shops or both. Men the city read at a glance and dismissed before learning what they did at 3 a.m. when nobody was filming. By his second year back, Tom had a routine that made room for sleep and left no room for drifting. Tuesdays and Fridays, he fixed small engines in a cinder-block garage off KOE for cash and parts. Wednesday mornings, he took 2 veterans to VA appointments because one could not drive after cataract surgery, and the other would skip if no one knocked. One Sunday a month, he worked donation runs for shelters when they were open, and left bags at church offices when they were not. He had worn the same Road King through 3 carburetors and 1 rebuilt transmission, kept receipts in a cigar box, and learned which municipal desks answered after 5 rings versus never. Survival was logistics once the drama burned off. 3 days before this morning, he had stood in a county hallway under flickering lights while a clerk explained that intake rules required categories, and categories required forms, and forms required a worker who was out sick. The clerk had not been cruel. She had been tired and exact. Tom had walked out with his jaw set and his hands loose, then gone home and folded children's jackets from a donation pile because someone had to do the small work while waiting on the large work to fail again. That was where he had found room in his life for strange notes on his doorstep. That was where he had kept going. Sandra shifted her weight and tucked the pen from behind her ear into her pocket. "Security's tense," she said. "Everyone can hear the bikes." "Let them hear," Tom said. Another wave of engine rumble rolled through the south wall, low enough to tremble the plastic medication cups on the nurse station counter. Outside, riders kept forming up in disciplined lanes under Lyle's clipboard and gate camera. But inside the hospital, the sound translated into old assumptions. A resident hurried by with her badge, turned backward and eyes fixed on her tablet. As if looking up might require interpretation, she did not have time for. A family member in a Bengals hoodie stepped out of room 212, saw Tom's cut, and stepped back in without speaking. Sandra watched the pattern and felt her own reflexes get exposed by it. Tom bent, picked up the grocery sack, and held it out to her. "These are clean," he said. "Whoever left them folded by size." Sandra took the bag and glanced inside. Purple leggings, flower button cardigan, socks. "Thank you," she said, formal in the way institutions taught gratitude when uncertainty remained. Then she pointed again, quieter now. "She can see you from there." He moved forward past the linen cart. The cold intensified near the exterior wall where the furnace line never pulled enough heat, and he could feel it through the denim at his knees as he lowered himself to one side of the alcove opening. The ice machine clicked and hummed. The vending machine cast weak light over the floor, flattening everything to washed-out color. Chipped baseboard paint, a dried splash of applesauce near the mop line, a child's shadow tucked into the corner between cinder block and cartwheel. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest and a blanket around her shoulders, the hospital bracelet sliding down her wrist whenever she shifted. Her hair had dried in uneven strands. One cheek held a faint grid pattern from resting against textured wall paint. The clear trash bag was upright against her shin, drawstring wrapped twice around her small fist. The rabbit, with one eye missing, stared through the plastic. She did not flinch when he came into view. She measured him instead, the way children do when adults have taught them to read weather faster than words. He stopped at a distance that gave her room and set himself on the tile, boots flat, forearms on his thighs, making his frame smaller than it was. "Morning, kid," he said. Her gaze dropped to his vest patch, then to the scar on his cheek, then to his hands. Hands told truth faster than faces. His were scarred, knuckles thick, nails clean, palms open. "You with them?" she asked, voice dry from sleep and hospital air. "Yeah," he said. "I'm Tom." She did not offer her name. She looked past him toward the corridor where footsteps passed and monitors chimed from closed rooms. He followed her glance and counted without turning his head. 1 orderly, 2 nurses, a physician assistant, none stopping, all seeing. The old instinct rose in him, then hard and immediate. The same one that had once made him pull over for a stalled sedan on Route 35 in sleet. The same one that put him between trouble and smaller bodies before his brain had finished argument. Instinct did not ask permission. It chose. He eased one hand into his vest pocket and drew out the folded note from his wallet. Not to show her yet, just to feel the paper edge against his thumb. For someone who needs them. Someone had written that before daylight with steady letters and no signature, trusting the sentence to find the right door. He looked at the child's shoes lined like a school drill beside the cart and understood, with the blunt certainty of a wrench seating on a bolt, that this was where the sentence had been headed. Sandra remained at the station, close enough to intervene, far enough not to crowd, her paper cup untouched. The corridor sounds thinned for a moment as shift change moved to other wings. In that narrow pocket of relative quiet, the rain returned against the far windows, soft and steady, and the engine rumble outside held its place under everything, not threatening, not fading, simply present, like a promise waiting for direction. Tom kept his voice low. "You eaten this morning?" She nodded once. "Feet warm?" Another nod. He glanced at the socks, then at the too small coat in the bag, then back to her face. Children usually mirrored the room they were in, loud when loud, restless when restless. She had gone still beyond her age, conserving motion like fuel. That stillness struck him harder than any bruise would have. It meant she had already learned not to expect rescue on first ask. A chime sounded overhead for laboratory pickup. Somewhere down the hall, a printer began spitting labels in a fast mechanical rhythm. Tom looked over his shoulder at Sandra, and she met his eyes with a look that carried 11 years of night shift and one unspoken admission. The system had held this child in place all night because no code on a screen had matched her. He had seen that before, too, in different uniforms and different buildings. Always the same outcome until someone stepped outside procedure and took responsibility with their own name attached. He turned back to the girl and shifted a little closer, slow enough that she could track each inch. "I'm going to stay right here," he said. "You're not by yourself." The sentence left his mouth before strategy, before consultation, before cost. It was not sentiment. It was assignment. Assignment meant he stopped looking for permission. Tom rose from the tile with one hand on his knee and turned toward the nurse station. Sandra had already opened a chart shell on the terminal. Blue screen glow on her face, cursor blinking in a field that wanted a guardian name she did not have. The corridor had filled again with ordinary hospital motion. Transport wheels squeaking, a supply cart rattling over a threshold strip, the smell of oatmeal from breakfast trays drifting in and fading under antiseptic. Ordinary and wrong. He walked to the counter and stood where she could hear him without raising his voice. "How long's she been sitting there?" he asked. Sandra looked at the wall clock first, then at the intake note she had started on the back of a lab requisition slip. "First visual at 2:07, she said. "Security confirmed no adult returned to claimer." He nodded once. "Who passed her?" Sandra gave him a tired, measured look. The kind that asks whether he wanted narrative or record. "Record?" she asked. "Record." She reached for a yellow legal pad clipped under a medication binder, pages bent at the corners from being shoved in and out of drawers all night, and read while Tom listened, with his jaw set and his hands flat on the laminate edge. At 2:14, ER Registrar Melissa Trent walked through pediatrics carrying admission stickers. At 2:19, Deputy Colin Reese came up from triage for coffee and waited near the vending machine 6 minutes. At 2:26, Pastor Neil Warren from Calvary Chapel visited room 209 and passed the alcove twice. At 2:31 and 2:34, Sandra called family intake and logged voicemail and callback delay. At 2:41, janitorial team shift B crossed with carts, both workers noting obstruction, but no intervention requested. At 2:52, 3 rideshare drivers entered for discharge pickups, looked, and moved on. At 3:03, social worker Dana Pike reviewed the preliminary screen and marked deferred intake pending county bed coding. At 3:17, lab runner, respiratory tech, 1 resident, 1 dietary aide, 1 environmental services supervisor. More names, more times, more roles. The list kept going. By the time Sandra reached 6:05, the count stood at 43 pass-through contacts within visual range of a 7-year-old sitting barefoot by a linen cart. 43, a registrar, a deputy, a pastor, 2 janitors, 3 rideshare drivers, a social worker, a volunteer chaplain, a county clerk dropping forms, an overnight pharmacist, a maintenance contractor, a neighbor from 2 streets over who recognized the child and kept walking, and the rest absorbed by shift change and policy language. Every one of them saw enough to know this was not routine. Every one of them had a reason to keep moving that would sound practical in daylight. Tom did not interrupt. He had spent enough years around official paperwork to know when shame got converted into passive verbs. Child observed. Intake deferred. Guardian unknown. He also knew when one person refused that grammar and wrote a sentence with a subject. Sandra had written one. At 6:12, she had logged, "Child remains unattended in pediatric corridor. Immediate placement risk if removed without verified protection." Her signature was under it, in hard pen strokes that dented the page. She set the pad down and rubbed 2 fingers across the bridge of her nose. I called Mercer County again at 6:18. They said no emergency foster bed coded for non-acute. No visible injury. Told me to hold until day supervisor. Tom let out a breath through his nose and looked past her toward the alcove where the child still sat, wrapped in hospital blanket, one hand on the drawstring of that clear bag as if the bag was the only legal claim she had left. No visible injury, he repeated. Sandra's mouth tightened. That's the phrase. At 7:11 on that Thursday in late October, a volunteer in a red vest came to the desk with a clipboard and asked whether she should continue comfort rounds. Sandra said yes without looking up. The volunteer turned, saw Tom's vest, saw the shoes by the wall, and pivoted back toward oncology. A resident stopped beside the med cart and whispered to another resident, eyes flicking to the south windows where the low vibration from idling engines trembled the glass. Tom watched them go. The city had one reflex for men in leather and another reflex for children in trouble, and both reflexes were on display under fluorescent lights. He tapped the legal pad with one knuckle. Make a copy. Sandra blinked once, then reached for the copier code sheet. I already made 3. One for charge packet, one for security, one in my locker. Tom met her eyes, and she understood the request underneath the words. Evidence did not protect anybody if it disappeared into a system that graded urgency by checkboxes. She slid one copy toward him. He folded it in half and put it into his vest pocket behind the anonymous note from his doorstep. Paper on paper. 2 different kinds of witness. He turned back to the alcove. The child had not cried once in 5 hours. That was the detail everyone would carry after they forgot the timestamps. When he knelt again, he kept the same distance as before, enough room for her to choose whether to close it. The corridor sound softened for a moment as an elevator door shut at the far end, and in that pocket of quiet he could hear rain beginning again against the ambulance bay glass, fine and steady like fingers on a drum. The blanket had slipped from one shoulder. He adjusted nothing. He waited. You got a name you want me to use? He asked. She watched his mouth when he spoke, then looked down at the rabbit through the clear plastic. Lily, she whispered. Okay, Lily. Her fingers tightened on the drawstring, knuckles pale against the bag's cloudy surface. She did not ask where he came from or why there were motorcycles outside or whether he knew the right people. Children in that posture did not ask for stories. They asked for terms. He saw her working up to one, breath-catching once, then smoothing out like she had practiced keeping her voice level, no matter what was happening around it. Sandra stood at the station with a stack of chart labels in her hand and did not pretend not to listen. Lily leaned forward just enough that he had to angle his head to hear. You said I wouldn't have to go back to intake, she whispered. Still true? The reminder was small. It landed hard enough to shift the whole room. Tom had heard screams in machine shops, in barracks bays, in county lockup, in parking lots where men settled old injuries with new fists. Those sounds were easy to classify. This was harder. A child checking whether an adult's promise could survive the next phone call, the next clipboard, the next handoff. She knew the sequence by name. She had lived it long enough to fear the process more than the people waiting outside. He answered without looking away from her. "Still true," he said. "I'm staying with you." Lily searched his face for a beat. Then another, reading for the wobble adults got when they promised what they could not hold. Whatever she saw, there was enough for her shoulders to drop half an inch. Not relief. Permission to breathe. From the station, Sandra spoke once low. "I can chart that she requested protective accompaniment." Tom glanced back. "Chart it." She nodded and typed, keys clicking in quick bursts. Request documented at 7:16. Child referenced, prior fear of intake return. Assurance reaffirmed. Protective adult present. Her cursor paused over the field labeled relationship to patient. She left it blank for 2 seconds, then entered witness. Lily touched the hospital bracelet with her thumb, sliding it up and down as if testing how tight it could be before it hurt. "They say wait," she whispered, eyes still on the rabbit. "Then another place? Then wait again." "I know," Tom said. "They said I was okay because I wasn't bleeding." The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor alarmed twice and reset. Tom felt the old anger come up. Not hot and wild like younger years, but cold and exact. A mechanic's anger that wanted torque values and proper sequence and no excuses. He kept it out of his voice. "You did nothing wrong," he said. She gave one quick shake of her head, not disagreement. More reflex, like the sentence had no shelf to land on yet. Then she looked at him directly for the first time since he had sat down. "Don't let them take my bag," she whispered. "My rabbit's in there." He nodded. "Bag stays with you." At 7:19, a clerk from county intake called back on Sandra's desk line and asked for the same reference number she had given twice already. Sandra put the call on speaker without asking and repeated the details in clipped professional cadence, while Tom remained on the tile beside Lily. The clerk said day supervisor would review at opening and requested they prepare transfer paperwork. Tom listened to policy language float down the hall in neutral verbs and deferred timelines. Sandra ended the call and wrote the clerk's name and extension on the corner of the yellow pad, pressing hard enough to tear through one layer. Lily had gone still again, listening to tones more than words. She did not look up when Sandra hung up. "Is that intake?" she asked. Tom said, "That was a phone." She waited. "I'm making one too," he said. He stood with a controlled push from his good leg and looked to Sandra. "Stairwell?" She pointed toward the south fire door. "Camera blind spot between landings." He held her gaze for one beat, acknowledging what she had just offered. Not concealment, but space to act, without immediate interference from people who would invoke policy before listening to outcome. Then he touched 2 fingers to the copy of the pass-through list in his pocket, turned, and walked to the stairwell door. The metal push bar was cold through his palm. Inside, the stairwell smelled of concrete dust and damp wool from coats brushing the railings all morning. The fluorescent tube above landing B flickered at one end, making a soft electrical buzz that matched his pulse for 2 seconds before he tuned it out. He took his phone from his vest, scrolled once, and hit Ray Sullivan's number. Ray answered on the second ring over the low backdrop of idling engines. "Yeah," Ray said. Tom kept his voice low and flat, each word placed where it needed to go. "Mercy General, south entrance. Use the riders already logged here. Send blanket runners in rotation and 2 documentation witnesses to pediatrics." A pause on the line. No questions, just breathing and distant motor noise. "Copy," Ray said and disconnected. Tom put the phone away. No speech, no second call, no bargaining with the county desk, no argument with people who already had their scripts. He stood in the stairwell for half a breath, listening to rain tick the narrow window at the landing and to the muted, disciplined thunder outside that remained in place. Then he pushed back through the fire door into pediatric, crossed to the alcove, and lowered himself to the tile beside Lily again, both hands visible, shoulders squared toward the corridor, waiting for the next sound. The next sound came up through the tile before it reached the windows, a low mechanical pressure that sat under the monitor chimes and the ventilation hiss, and then pushed both aside, not louder at first, only heavier, like weather settling over a roofline. Tom felt it through his boots and through the knee that woke him in cold months. A familiar vibration with a different weight today, because it was not passing traffic and not a weekend ride drifting downtown for noise. It held steady and organized, wave after wave, each interval measured. Lily heard it too. Her hand tightened on the trash bag drawstring, then loosened when she saw he had not moved. Sandra looked toward the south wall as medication cups quivered in their sleeve. The volunteer in red vest stopped mid-step by room 213 and waited as if listening for thunder she could not place. A respiratory therapist at the far desk muted her phone and stood still. The corridor did what crowds do when a single, unknown sound takes ownership of a space. It paused all at once, then pretended not to. Tom stayed on the floor beside Lily, shoulders squared toward the hallway, palms visible on his thighs. He had asked for blankets and witnesses. The answer was arriving by the chestful. At 7:23 on that Thursday morning in late October, Lyle's voice came over the clipped security radio at the nurse station, flattened by static but clear enough to carry count. South gate to internal. Additional arrivals in formation. Logging continues. No one responded for 3 seconds. Then dispatch answered from somewhere near emergency. Copy. Keep lanes clear to Ambulance Bay. Sandra did not touch the volume knob. She let the whole corridor hear it. The rumble built in layers. Engines idled low outside the south entrance while new riders turned in from Main and Jefferson. Tires whispering over wet pavement, exhaust notes overlapping until the sound stopped being individual machines and became one sustained body that entered bone before ear. A child in room 211 started crying at the change in vibration and was hushed by a mother behind a partly closed curtain. An intern at the computer bank whispered, "How many are there?" and got no answer because the answer was still being counted. Tom watched Lily's face as each wave came in. She did not flinch. She listened the way he had listened on convoy roads, sorting pattern from threat. Sandra's desk phone lit with an outside line, likely intake, and she let it ring twice while she wrote the time on her legal pad. Then she picked up. "Pediatrics, Briggs." Pause. "No. Transfer is not in motion." Another pause, her jaw hardening. "You can speak to security about entry status. I am with a child." She hung up, logged the call, and underlined the timestamp once. Tom caught the motion from the corner of his eye and knew she had crossed from compliance to record. A deep pulse rolled through the glass, then diminished in sequence as engines began cutting outside. Not chaotic, not one rider deciding for another, but one row at a time. The sound stepped down by bands, each shut off revealing the thinner hospital noises beneath it. Elevator bell, printer chatter, the click of that broken ice machine. Lily's gaze lifted toward the corridor window where the reflection of moving headlights washed across the floor in pale bars. Tom leaned toward her, voice low enough to stay between them. "Those are my people," he said. She searched his face, then nodded once. Over the radio, Lyle spoke again, breath a little short from moving between cones and plate checks. Southgate final verified count. Static crackled. 318 motorcycles logged. Repeat, 318. Engines down in sequence. Access lanes open. 318. The number sat in the corridor like a placed object. Sandra exhaled through her nose and wrote 318 in the margin of her notes, circling it hard enough to score the paper. A resident who had been hovering by the med cart looked toward Tom, then toward the windows, and did not leave. Even people who distrusted what they saw understood arithmetic when it arrived this precisely. They had heard the weight first. Now they had the figure. Tom stood with a controlled push from his right leg and turned to Sandra. "I need 2 blankets here," he said. "Dry ones." She did not hesitate. "Already on the way." He crouched again so Lily never had to look up at a wall of adults. The hallway had changed temperature, not from the furnace, from attention. Staff moved with intention now, clipboards in hand, phones out, names written down where before there had been glances and deferrals. Outside the building, the engines were mostly silent, but the silence felt ceremonial rather than empty because it was built on numbers and order. Inside, the social contract that had thinned overnight was beginning to thicken in front of witnesses. The first 2 riders came through South Entrance at 7:28 with visitor bands on their wrists, helmets in hand, boots wiped on the mat without being asked. One carried 6 sealed fleece blankets in clear packaging from a wholesale box. The other carried a plastic tote with new socks, youth sweatpants, bottled water, and 2 clipboards. Both stopped at security, signed in with full names, and waited for escort. No one raised voices. No one played at intimidation. They moved like men loading a trailer in rain, exact and efficient because imprecision cost time. Ray Sullivan entered on the next wave, denim darkened at the shoulders, legal pad under one arm with rows of plate numbers written in pencil stub shorthand. He saw Tom by the alcove and gave a single nod, then looked to Sandra. "Ma'am, we're here as requested," he said. Sandra measured him for 1 beat and answered in her professional register. "You stay where assigned and you don't obstruct care." Ray nodded. "That's the plan." Tom did not stand to greet him. He kept his place beside Lily while Sandra mapped positions on the back of a supply requisition form. 2 lines outside the ambulance bay, with a center corridor for gurneys, 1 line at family intake doors with 6-foot spacing, rotating 6-man watch at pediatric corridor intersection so no one approached Lily without passing a witness first. Ray copied each position, tore the sheet in half, and handed directives to the men nearest him. Logistics, not theater. The wall formed from instructions. By 7:34, 12 riders were posted outside in rain-dark formation, backs to the building, faces to the street, leaving clear ingress for EMS vehicles. At intake, 8 more stood off the threshold line, hands empty, IDs visible, each paired with another rider carrying a small notebook. Inside pediatrics, 6 men rotated in 2-person sets every 15 minutes, checked in and out on Sandra's clipboard, and stayed far enough from patient room doors to avoid disruption. One of them, a former electrician named Paul Merritt with bifocals and a tremor in his left hand, set a folding chair against the wall and used it only when his knee locked. No one leaned on nurses' desks. No one blocked crash carts. The documentation team came in at 7:39. 2 riders with chest-mounted cameras switched to continuous record. A retired county paralegal from the club's support circle, carrying notary seal and bound journal, and a woman from courthouse records who had finished night filing and stayed when she saw the count outside. They took statements in plain sequence, starting with Sandra, then Lyle, Then the janitor, who had passed at 241 and came back now with his cap in his hands and said, voice shaking, I saw her and kept moving. The paralegal stamped each page, logged each time, and stored copies in 2 envelopes marked Mercy General and Mercer Intake. Physical evidence stopped being rumor the moment paper met signatures. Lily watched all of it from behind the linen cart opening, blanket around her shoulders, rabbit still visible through plastic. She did not ask why so many men had come. She seemed to understand the structure by feel, doors now watched, names now written, adults now speaking in accountable sentences instead of soft postponements. Tom handed her a bottle of water with the cap loosened halfway so she could twist it without effort. She drank 3 small swallows and set it upright beside her shoes. At 7:46, County Intake called again. Sandra put it on speaker at Tom's request. Supervisor Martin, the voice said, we are prepared to proceed with standard transfer once transport is available. Tom stayed seated and answered without heat. Child remains in place with witnesses. You can send supervisor on site with emergency authority and review document pass-through log before any movement. The line went quiet. Then the supervisor said, careful now. Who is this? Witness, Tom said, and handed the phone back to Sandra. Sandra added, I have notarized statements pending upload and security logs confirming protected corridor status. We need on-site review. Understood, the voice said, flatter than before. I'll escalate. She ended the call and wrote escalate at 7:47. Outside, the formation tightened as rain picked up. Jackets darkening, exhaust heat ghosting from cooling pipes. The wall held its geometry without speeches. Ambulances still moved through the center lane when dispatched, and each time riders stepped back in unison to clear the path, then resumed position with the same spacing. From the pediatric window, the line looked almost architectural, verticals and chrome arcs against wet brick and sodium light. People who had parked to watch for trouble now watched procedure happen instead. Inside the corridor, the change showed in smaller details. A resident who had avoided the alcove all morning came over with a pediatric pulse oximeter and asked Lily, "May I check your finger?" Then waited for consent. The volunteer in red vest returned with coloring pages and asked Sandra where to place them. The social worker who had marked deferred intake at 3:03 requested to amend her note in person and stood by while the documentation camera recorded the correction. Every adjustment carried timestamp now. Accountability had acquired witnesses in boots. Tom kept his body between Lily and the open hallway, not looming, just present. When his knee stiffened, he shifted weight and settled again. He did not perform comfort he had not earned. He offered terms and kept them. "Bag stays with you," he reminded her once when a supply aide reached for the drawstring to make room and then stepped back at his look. Lily nodded and tucked the rabbit deeper under the shirts. By 7:58, the rotating 6-man watch changed again. Ray checked the sign-in sheet, initialed each line, and passed Sandra a duplicate copy for her locker with the first list of 43 pass-through names clipped to it. Thread by thread, the night's neglect was being tied to morning records, so it could not disappear at shift end. Tom watched that packet change hand and felt the same hard certainty he had felt when he read the doorstep note. Small actions, properly documented, could force larger systems to move. Lily leaned toward him just enough that her shoulder touched his sleeve. "They're staying?" she whispered. He looked at the corridor, at Sandra with her pen moving, at Ray repositioning riders by the intake map, at the south windows where 318 motorcycles stood in rain with the lanes clear and watches rotating. "Yeah," he said. "They're staying." She rested her hand on the top of her bag, and for the first time since he had seen her, Let her shoes fall out of perfect alignment. Tom watched the shoes drift out of parallel and knew that was the first true answer he had gotten all morning. At 8:06, the county day supervisor came through the south entrance with a rolling case, a state badge clipped crooked to her blazer, and rain beating on the shoulders of her coat. Her name was Janice Martin, 46, Franklin County transfer, 3 years earlier, and she carried herself like someone who had learned to survive by sounding procedural before she sounded human. Deputy Colin Reese walked 2 paces behind her, same deputy who had stood by the vending machine before dawn, hat in hand now, jaw set tight. Lyle met them at security, checked IDs, pointed to the sign-in sheet, and read the rules in a voice that never rose. Clear lanes, no unscheduled movement. Witnesses present in pediatrics. Sandra did not leave the corridor. She had already built a packet on the nurse station counter, with color tabs torn from old lab labels. Call log times, deferred intake note, the list of 43 pass-through contacts, security's gate count, and the first 6 notarized statements with seal impressions still damp enough to shine under fluorescent light. The retired paralegal from Ray's team stood beside her, with the bound journal open and a black pen uncapped. Ray stayed 10 feet back and said nothing. The riders on corridor watch shifted to give Martin a direct line to the alcove, then reset their spacing by the taped floor marks Sandra had laid down from the wound dressing tape. Martin read fast. Her eyes stopped once at 231 voicemail, once at 303 deferred intake, and again at Sandra's 716 protective accompaniment entry, where relationship to patient had been typed as witness. She looked up at Tom on the tile by Lily, and then at Lily's clear bag, the rabbit's missing eye visible between 2 folded shirts. "I need to interview the child," she said. Tom answered without standing. "You can do it right there. She keeps her bag." Martin started to object, glanced at the notarized seal, at the body camera's red lights, at Deputy Reese refusing to meet her eye, and recalibrated. "Fine," she said. She crouched to Lily's level, knees cracking in the quiet. "Hi, Lily, I'm Janice. I work with family intake." Lily did not lean toward her. She looked at Tom first, waited for the smallest nod, then turned back and whispered, "I know." Martin held still for a beat that seemed to stretch down the corridor. "Do you feel safe here right now?" "Yes," Lily whispered. "With Mr. Dixon and Nurse Briggs present." Lily nodded. "Do you want to return to intake today?" Lily's fingers tightened on the drawstring. "No." Martin closed her notebook halfway, opened it again, and wrote in block letters instead of shorthand. At 8:21, she stood and requested a direct line to juvenile duty court. Sandra handed her the desk phone and turned on speaker without being asked. The judge's clerk answered on the 3rd ring. Martin gave case reference, then amended in real time. On-site review completed. Documented overnight institutional delay. Immediate protective hold requested pending kin placement verification. The clerk transferred her up. Everyone in the corridor heard Martin repeat the facts in a voice stripped of buffer language. At 8:37, authority came back through static and courthouse echo. Emergency protective hold granted effective immediately. Child not to be transferred to county intake facility. Kinship contact in Kettering to be verified and presented same day. Sandra wrote the order time on 3 separate forms and signed each. The paralegal notarized 2 witness copies. Lyle's radio confirmed receipt to Security Command. External calls had outcomes now, stamped and cross-referenced instead of deferred. Deputy Reese stepped forward before anyone asked him to and cleared his throat. "I passed her at 2:19, he said, looking at Sandra, not Tom. "Saw the bracelet. Told myself staff had it. I was wrong." The paralegal wrote his statement word for word and slid the page to him. He signed without edits. Pastor Neil Warren, listed at 226, did not return and never submitted a statement that morning. The neighbor from 2 streets over arrived at 9:04 after Lyle's call, eyes red, and signed one line that said she had recognized Lily and kept walking because she feared getting involved in custody trouble. The volunteer in the red vest, who had stopped mid-step earlier, came back with a box of crayons and whispered to Sandra, "Put these where kids can reach them without asking," then did exactly that and logged her name for follow-up. The resident who had hovered by the med cart signed as medical witness after taking Lily's vitals with permission and speaking to her in complete sentences for the first time. At 9:18, with hold order entered and kin verification underway, Sandra carried Tom's grocery sack to the alcove and set it down beside Lily. "These were dropped on his porch," she said. "Clean and your size, maybe." Lily opened the bag with both hands and touched each item like she was counting proof. Purple leggings, socks still folded at the heel, flower button cardigan. She looked up at Tom. "Can I wear this one?" she asked, lifting the cardigan. "Your call," he said. Sandra cleared room 214 and gave Lily privacy with the pediatric aide, then returned 8 minutes later with Lily in dry clothes, sleeves a little long, buttons mismatched once then fixed. Lily carried her old leggings folded into a square and placed them in the clear bag above the rabbit, careful not to crush the ear seam, stitched in red thread. She sat down beside Tom again, closer this time, and without announcement put her small hand into his left hand where the knuckles had scar ridges from old breaks and convoy works. She did it as if she had already decided it was allowed. That was the image Sandra would keep when paperwork blurred later. A child in a flower button cardigan, one hand on a trash bag that held everything she owned, the other hand inside a biker's rough palm on a waxed hospital floor, while 318 motorcycles stood silent outside to make sure no one moved her by convenience again. By 10:12, Janice Martin had verified the maternal aunt in Kettering, Angela Price, age 34, elementary cafeteria manager, no adverse findings on expedited check. Angela arrived at Mercy at 10:49 with her work badge still on, hairnet marks faint on her forehead, and a booster seat buckled in the back of a 10-year-old Civic. She knelt in front of Lily, said her name once, and waited. Lily studied her face, then nodded. No one rushed the moment. Martin read the hold conditions aloud. Angela signed placement acceptance. Sandra copied IDs, stapled forms, and put one notarized packet in hospital risk management drop safe at 11:03, one in Martin's case file, and one sealed envelope in Tom's hand at Ray's request for independent archive. Physical evidence had a chain now. At 11:17, the corridor watch stood down by rotation order. Riders exited in pairs, signed out, and returned visitor bands in a clear bin, Lyle labeled with black tape. Outside engines fired in staggered sequence and rolled off by platoons. Lanes still open, no burnouts, no shouting, only wet tires and disciplined departure. Gate logs closed at 11:42 with final count unchanged. 318 in, 318 out. Lyle clipped the sheet to security incident file and handed Sandra a copy for her locker beside the curled July maintenance slip about the ice machine that still clicked every 18 seconds. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in early December, Tom carried 2 plastic totes through Mercy's south entrance for the first official hallway closet shift, a converted supply room Sandra had fought through administration to secure with coded access, inventory forms, and open shelves labeled by size instead of diagnosis. The old Mercy Genera sign still missed its final letter. The pediatric clock above room 214 had finally been reset to match real time. The ice machine had been replaced, The corridor sounded different in the small way that means somebody followed through. He finished stacking sweatshirts and stepped back into the cold at 7:26 p.m. Rain had not started yet, but the air held that metallic edge that comes first in Ohio winters. When he reached his duplex on Linden, porch light buzzing with moths, he saw a neat stack of laundered children's clothes on the mat again, folded by size, mittens on top. Another note sat under a smooth stone to keep it from lifting in the wind. Same careful block letters, for someone who needs them. He did not unfold it right away. He looked at the lower loops of the F and the long tail on the G, then opened his wallet and set the new note beside the first one he had kept behind his daughter's photo. The handwriting matched Lily's thank you line from the hallway closet card taped to Sandra's clipboard 3 days earlier. He stood on the porch with both notes in his hand while the street stayed quiet, and a freight train moved somewhere far west of downtown. Reputation had failed where character acted. The people dismissed as danger had become the reason a child was no longer invisible.